There comes, even to kings, the time of great weariness. Then the gold of the throne is brass. The silk of the palace becomes drab. The gems in the diadem and upon the fingers of the women sparkle drearily, like the ice of the white seas. The speech of men is as the empty rattle of a jester's bell. And the feel comes of things unreal. Even the sun is copper in the sky. And the breath of the green ocean is no longer fresh. Kull sat upon the throne of Velusia, and the hour of weariness was upon him. That is from The Mirrors of Tuzun Thune, a Kull story, and it's the Kull story we're going to be talking about this week on The Robert E. Howard Show. It is The Robert E. Howard Show once again. And this week we are going to be talking a little bit more about King Kull, the Kull stories of Robert E. Howard. So I already talked about The Shadow Kingdom, which was the first published Kull story. And this week we're going to be talking about a very different story, The Mirrors of Tuzun Thune. This story is a lot different than most of the stories that Howard wrote. It is not an action-packed story. There's really no action in it, which is pretty unusual. However, it is considered a great Robert E. Howard story. It's very popular among Robert E. Howard fans. And it's a very well-written story. It's an interesting little one. In it, we have King Kull, who sits upon the throne. And as you can see from that little description from the very beginning of the story, he's depressed. Kull had a tendency towards depression, much like Robert E. Howard himself. And I've mentioned before that I think Kull is a lot more like Robert E. Howard than most of Robert E. Howard's characters. He put a lot of himself into Kull, I think. And Kull was in a black mood, a despondent, dark mood, just depressed upon the throne of Velusia. And nothing could seem to get him out of this depression. His good pal Bruhl, the spear slayer, was like, come on, man, let's go hunting or sailing around or something. Let's get out of the palace for a while. That'll snap you out of it. And he's like, no, I don't think it's going to. His depression was too deep. And so we have a story that's kind of interesting because it's about a heroic fantasy character who's depressed, which was unusual. And is still kind of unusual. And we have Kull in this state, and while he's in this state, this mysterious woman comes up to him and says, you know, I know what'll help you. You should go see Tuzun Thune the wizard. Take a look at his mirrors. So Tuzun Thune is a wizard, and he's supposed to be very, very wise and know all the secrets of mankind. So Kull is like, what the hell? What do I have to lose? I'll go talk to this wizard and see what he really knows. So on this mysterious woman's advice, he goes and sees this wizard in this wizard's house. And he does have a lot of mirrors there, just a bunch of mirrors in his house. And Kull asks him a few questions, trying to see how wise this guy really is. And he just kind of gives these vague answers in return that just kind of could mean anything, you know, kind of like charlatans do, you know. And he says, you know, Kull, what you really have to do is just sit there and take a look in my mirrors for a while. You might see something that'll help you out. So Kull, despondent Kull, sits down there and takes a look in the mirrors. And indeed, he starts to see something in the mirrors. He's seeing his reflection, but then he's wondering, you know, is that really me? Is that the real Kull in that mirror? Am I the false Kull? He has all kinds of these introspective questions that the mirrors bring up. And then he actually does start to see some things the more he stares into these mirrors. He sees a whole other world. In fact, at one point he sees the future. And Tuzun Thune says, "This is the future." Kull looked in silence. "See you what?" "A strange world," said Kull heavily. "The 7 empires are crumbled to dust and are forgotten. The restless green waves roar for many a fathom above the eternal hills of Atlantis. The mountains of Lemuria of the west are the islands of an unknown sea. Strange savages roam the elder lands, and new lands flung strangely from the deeps, defiling the elder shrines. Volusia is vanished, and all the nations of today, they of tomorrow, are strangers. They know us not." So he's looking into these mirrors, and he sees the future, and it kind of bums him out even more, really, because as he looks in these mirrors, he sees the future. He sees that Atlantis and all the continents have been covered by the waves. His kingdom is not even a memory anymore, which sort of gives him a sense of futility, as if he didn't already feel that enough. So he keeps coming back every day to stare into these mirrors. And he becomes really detached from everyday reality. He's not getting his job done as king. He's letting stuff just slide. He has no interest in things anymore. Something's obviously really wrong with him at this point. And at one point, as he's looking into the mirrors, he starts to slide away from reality. He actually starts to vanish into the mirrors. But fortunately, Bruhl the Spear Slayer, his best friend, shows up just in time to save his life. Bruhl, Kull's best friend, who started off kind of as an enemy, who's now his best friend in these stories, is always showing up to save Kull. He saves Kull like all the time, Bruhl does. And so Bruhl shows up once again to save Kull. And of course, it was all a plot. And I give this all away because the plot of this story sort of doesn't matter. It's not really what's important about the story. There are a couple important things about the story. It's an unusual story. It's about an introspective king who's depressed. And by the end of the story, he's even more unsure of reality than he was at the beginning of the story. So there's no resolution. He sort of breaks out of his depression a bit so he can carry on. But it's not completely left him. It's still something that he carries with him and is going to carry with him throughout his life. His brooding black moods will never completely go away. And it's an interesting story for Robert E. Howard to write. It's also interesting because of how well written it is. It's a very well written story. It's a short little story, but Kull's experiences with Tuzun Thune's mirrors and slipping away from reality, it's all really well done. It's really interesting. And so it's a good little Robert E. Howard story that's unusual. And I'm not surprised that this is one of the Kull stories that was actually published. Most of the Kull stories were not. But this one was of high enough quality that it was. And even though it was a pretty unusual story for Robert E. Howard, like I said, it's one of the ones that's well remembered from him. So yeah, The Mirrors of Tuzun Thune. An unusual Kull story. An unusual Robert E. Howard story. Next week, we're going to be talking about a much different story. Next week, what do we have? We have The Cat and the Skull next week, which is possibly, well, It is. It is one of the worst Robert E. Howard stories ever written. And it might be the worst Robert E. Howard story ever written. It's going to be an interesting look at this story, The Cat in the Skull, next week. And then things get better after that. So I'll catch you next week for the Robert E. Howard Show. Thanks, guys.